Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to use GitHub. Sort of just going through a basic explanation of what exactly it is, what are some uses for it, and creating your first repository, and really how to best use it in your practices. So just to give a quick explanation of what GitHub is. So GitHub is basically a website that allows you to publish and maintain these things called Git repositories. And I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but just to give some context, a Git repository is basically like a way to store your code, right? So it's one place that you can put all of your code for one singular project, and what Git enables you to do is essentially be able to control any changes that you make to that repository, so that, you know, if you make a mistake or you want to review past code, or maybe the code that you wrote no longer works and you want to revert to your previous version, then what Git allows you to do is essentially it will save every version of that repository. Sort of similar to like when you're editing a document in Google Docs and you have a version history where you can revert the version to a different version, right? And you can also see the changes that were made in between versions. It's the exact same thing with Git repositories, except instead of it being words that are changed, it's lines of code, right? So Git enables you to really keep track of changes made to your code and be able to stay on top of that. The fancy term for it is version control. So it's essentially a version control software. So GitHub is basically an online platform that enables you to create and publish your own Git repositories. And there are many uses for GitHub in that instance, but I mean, whether it's for publishing your own code for production, or really just for your own personal uses, there's really a lot of things you can do with GitHub, but I'm just going to be showing the absolute basics of how to use it. It's a good thing to get in the practice of using, especially if you want to expand your skill set in coding. This is definitely something you want to get intimate with, and it's not hard. It's not hard to get into. So yeah, so let's start off here. So the first thing you guys want to do is go to the website github.com, and you'll be put on this page here. So if you don't already have a GitHub account, which I'm assuming you don't, you'll need to go down here and sign up for GitHub. So you can put in your email address, email@gmail.com, just as an example, and it's going to bring you to this interactive form. So you're just gonna, all right, let's do okay, so it's gonna bring you to this form. So you enter your email there, and then they're gonna ask you to enter a password. This can be anything really. So once you make the password, then you make a username. We'll say, I don't know, not available. That's crazy. Okay. So then you, this is up to you. If you want emails, I'll just say no. And then you'll want to do this CAPTCHA puzzle. So you find the two identical objects, and it's gonna vary for you, but I've seen some people get a CAPTCHA where it says like a phrase in the image, and you have to discern the phrase. It'll differ, but you just do this CAPTCHA, and then you should be able to create the account here. Now, I'm not gonna actually go through with this because I already have an account. So for me, I'm just gonna sign in here. All right, so once you are in the GitHub, your page might not look exactly like this, but don't worry too much about it. I'm just gonna briefly take you guys through the site and show you a few things that you'll want to know. So exactly, the first thing we're going to do is create a repository. So there are two ways to do this, technically three, but I'm not going to show you one of them because it's a little too advanced. But I'm going to show you two ways to do this. So the first way is you see this button right here, the new button. So you can click that and that will make a repository. But in case for whatever reason you don't see that, if you click on the plus button right here, you should be able to see the new repository button. So this is what you want to do if you want to start publishing your code here for a certain project. This is the button you want to press. So we're going to press new repository, and it's going to prompt us to put a name for the repository. I would recommend keeping this name concise. Make it something that you can easily remember, and especially if this is a project that you are going to be working on a lot, it should be short, because a lot of the times you're going to have to actually reference this repository and its name, so you don't want to make like a super long name, right? So I don't know, like test repository, right? You don't have to put a description, you don't want to, and this is entirely up to you whether this should be public or not, depending on the exact purpose of your project. If it is public, like it says here, you can choose who can commit, which basically means just because it's public doesn't mean everyone in the world can edit the code. Only people that you authorize can edit the code. It's just that everyone can view and use the code. So if you want to open source your code, then you would make a public repository. But otherwise, for most projects, you would probably be using a private repository, especially if there is some sensitive information in the code, such as tokens or cookies or whatever. I don't know why you'd have that in your code in the first place, but if for whatever reason it is, you should probably be using a private repository. You don't really need a README file unless your teacher asks you to make one. You don't need one necessarily. This just enables you to write a description, which is different from this. This is like a short blurb. This can be as long as you want, so it's different. And choosing a license, really the only license you would need to worry about is the MIT license, which this, as far as I know, allows other people to use your code as long as it is not for commercial purposes. I'm not 100% on that, but they have a explanation of all licenses there if you're curious. One thing to note is if you do not select a license and you leave it on none, by default you're going to have exclusive copyright over the repository, which might restrict how much of the code can actually be used by other people. I mean, if this is, like I said, if it's just personal use, then you don't really need to worry about that stuff. So once you create a repository, it's going to bring up, here, let's make one right now. So once you create the repository, this is what you're going to see on the page. Like you see here after the README file, so I can actually edit this and put in whatever I want. And you can preview it here, so you can see if you just want to explain what the code does, goals, whatever, you can do that. We're just going to leave that for now. So right now there's no code in here because we've just created the repository, so there's no code whatsoever. We have to upload our code. What we're actually going to do is I'm going to open up an existing repository and show you guys how to use that, how to use an existing repository, but it's one and the same, really. It's one and the same. So for this, we're going to be using a software called GitHub Desktop. This is a application that allows you to it creates an interface for you to download repositories and modify the code, right? Because normally you would do this through a command prompt, but that can get a little tricky. Honestly, I prefer using UI as well. So this is just much easier to use. So I'm going to be showing you guys, for the purposes of this tutorial, how to use GitHub Desktop to modify repos. So we're just going to install this, and it's going to ask you to log in again. So we click sign into github.com. If you're logged in the Chrome, it should automatically log you in there. But in case you're not, then you can fill that out. So use my GitHub account name and address. You can do that if you want. It's good for me. And now we are brought to this page. So you can see here, we can create a new repository here. This is the second way to create a repository. But what we're going to do is we're actually going to clone from the internet. And so cloning a repository is basically copying the code onto your computer. And in some instances, this requires you to fork the repository, which basically means making your own version, because some repositories don't allow you to edit the actual thing, but rather they want you to make a fork, which is your own private version of the code. You can see here there's actually the fork button here. So yeah, like it says here, fork is a copy of a repository, allows you to freely experiment with changes without affecting the original project. And in many ways, in many instances, this is the only way to experiment with the code. You cannot access it directly for big repositories. So we're going to be using the Kwantlen Park CSF website repo as an example for this. You can see there's two forks here. So I have a fork, and I already have some code here that this branch is one commit ahead. So I'm going to show you guys exactly what that means. So we're going to go ahead and clone the forked repository, which is right here. And we're just going to clone it. And what that'll do is it'll just basically put the code onto our hard drive so that we can freely modify the code. So the first thing we're going to do is open up Visual Studio. You can really open any IDE of your choice, doesn't really matter. Alright, so what we're going to do now is I've gone ahead and opened the repository in Visual Studio Code. If you want to do this, all you need to do is go to, when you open Visual Studio, you go to the Explorer button, and then it's going to give you the option to open a new folder. From that, you want to open up the folder that the repository is within. For most people, it's going to be under the Documents folder in your C drive. So you go to the Documents folder, and then go to GitHub, and then whatever the name of the repository is, you should see a folder there. You just open that folder, and then it'll bring you to this page. So essentially, we've cloned. If we look at the fork here, we've cloned the code from this repository onto our system, and we can actually modify the code here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you guys two things. I'm going to show you guys how to actually modify the files themselves, such as creating or deleting files, and the code. But really, it's quite simple. Let's just say I wanted to, right, just some random stuff, right? So say I want to make it do that in our JavaScript, and then let's say I decided to change the name of the JavaScript file, JScript. Then we have to change the reference there. It's just an example. If we go back to our GitHub Desktop app, we can see that originally there's no changes, and now we have 3 changes. So we can see 3 of the changes we made here, and there are 3 different symbols. So it actually shows us what each of these mean, new and deleted. But just to give a brief explanation, modified is the yellow symbol, and that simply means that the code itself has been modified from the original. So there are some changes to the code from the original. We can see here that it shows us clearly what exactly the changes were. So we can see that this red means that this line was removed and this line was added. More specifically, the J letter was added. Right, so you can use this to really ensure that the code that you wrote is correct, the changes you made is correct, right? You can just sort of double check your code here. The next change we have is an addition, and this was simply adding code to the file. So this is new code we've added. See, it's sort of the same thing as here. And lastly, you see there's no content changes here, and that's because we simply renamed the file, and it doesn't consider that as a modification. It considers it that we deleted the file and created a new one, but all we did was just rename it. But that's why it says deleted. If you actually deleted the file itself, it would say the same thing. So we have the code saved here. It's already saved in this file, but if we go refresh this, we can see that the script.js is still the same name, right? So how do we get the script.js to change? How do we get our changes published? Well, what we have to do is we have to commit the change. And you notice here that I said that this branch is 1 commit ahead. I've actually already made a change previously, but I have not committed that yet. But we will, I haven't created a pull request, but we will do that in this video. But how exactly do we get this how exactly do we commit this code to the repository so that the changes reflect on this site? So it's pretty easy. All you have to do is write a really quick summary of like the changes that we made to the repository. So it can be very brief, like added. But what I do, I renamed script file, right? You can write a description if you want. You don't really have to, but so you could write a description like that. Like I said, you don't have to, but it's a nice thing to have. So from this, all we're going to do really is, you notice that we can press the commit to main button. So that's what we're going to do. And we can see that we just committed the change. But if we refresh the page, it's still one commit ahead. Nothing has changed. And that's because we have to push the change. So you can see here, push commits to the origin remote. So committing the change is like setting in stone, okay, this code is good, this is ready to publish online. Pushing the code, pushing the commit is actually the actual act of publishing the code onto the repository. So all we have to do is press the push origin button up here. And you might have to fetch origin depending on how out of date your code is first. But we just pushed it. So now if we refresh, we can see 2 commits ahead. And we have the jscript.js file. So we've now published our change to this repository. And if this was your own private repository, that's really all you need to do to publish the change. But since this is a fork repository, that's actually the first step to getting this code online. The next step is creating a pull request to merge with the main repository. So a pull request is basically you have your code, and your code is updated, right? You have new changes to your code, but you want to add those changes to this repository because, like I said, in some cases you cannot edit the repository directly. You have to fork it and then make changes in that fork, and then from that fork you can publish any changes to the repository using pull requests. So pull requests, it's basically a request to the repository administrators to say, hey, I want to merge my branch with yours. I have some changes here that I believe would be useful, and this is what I did. So we can make a pull request, and to do this, we open the pull requests tab on the main page. We press new pull request, and at first it's going to show you this, right? Choose different branches or forks above. So right now it's only looking at this repository, but we have a different repository, right? So we want to press the compare across forks button, and that will show us 2 things: the base repository and the head repository. The base repository is the one that we want to publish our changes to. This is the main one. Then the head repository is the one that we have the changes. So you can see here that once we change it to my version, that we have 2 changes that we can commit. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a pull request. And this is basically just, like I said, it's what allows us to request that we merge the 2 branches, and basically just merging them means to put your changes of code onto the main one, and that way then they'll be the same, since the changes you've made have just been published to the main one and they're both the same from that. So that's what it means to merge them. So right now we're going to request to merge them, and typically if you were just someone working on this, you weren't a maintainer, and then you would just have to create the pull request and wait for someone to approve it. But since I am a maintainer of this repository, I can just approve my own. Technically, I can just make changes to the one directly to the repository, but I'm going to make a PR here. So really, we can just say this the same thing here. So we can just say then just leave a comment. So what you'll want to do once you finish the description here is you'll want to add two things really. You want to add a reviewer and an assignee. So the reviewer is someone who's going to look over your code and approve the code. So typically for this GitHub repository, the CSF website, you'll want to put the web project leads as the reviewers, so that the project leads can look over it and approve it. For the assignees, you'll simply want to put obviously yourself and really anyone else who worked on the code. So if someone helped you with it, then I would recommend putting them there, because then that way, if there's any questions about the code, then they can help you out. You don't necessarily have to put a label, but I would recommend doing it if you can, whether it's adding a new feature, a bug, really anything. Pull requests aren't necessarily limited to just adding new code, but in general, this is what we're going to be using it for. So we can create the pull request now, assuming we have the reviewers. And now it's going to create a pull request on the repository. Normally, if you were just a regular editor of the repository, you wouldn't really have any options to merge or approve the pull request. So this isn't really anything that would pertain to that. But for a maintainer, they would see this pull request and they'll be able to look at the files changed. And remember, we looked at the same thing in our GitHub Desktop in here. You can't see it anymore, but we can look at the same things here. We can compare the code, and based upon that, we can approve the pull request. But yeah, so that's how you make a pull request to a repository. So any repository that does not enable you to edit the code directly, this is how you get your changes onto there, by forking the repository. And then from that fork, you can make changes to it, as many changes as you want, and then commit those changes and create a pull request to merge your version of the code with the main version. And just as a reminder, you fork a repository by pressing the fork button in the top right here when you're on the page, and it'll prompt you to create a new private version of the repository, which is basically what a fork is. So I think that will do it for this video. If you have any questions about how to use GitHub, please let me know in the comments and I'll try my best to answer. It's a little difficult to get into the habit of using, but once you do, you'll find that it's very, very useful for really keeping your code consistent and keeping track of any changes you make and really just keeping it organized. It's a great thing. It's a great tool to use. It's a great thing to get used to. So definitely get some practice using it. I feel like GitHub Desktop is definitely the easiest way to use it. There are some other methods, like I said, but from using GitHub Desktop, using a user-friendly interface like this, hopefully you guys will be able to get used to GitHub and use it in your projects, both now and in the future. And yeah, thanks for watching. And like I said, any questions, let me know in the comments, and happy coding.